Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I'm Ari Thurger and today I'm going to talk about a common misconception which has been debunked in academia for some time now. However, some authors cling on to this mistake, a honest mistake I must say, but I think it's important to address this subject to avoid feeding this error, which is the belief that Thor's hammer is associated with the swastika or that the swastika itself is the representation of Thor's hammer. This isn't true. As you know, for whichever political purposes, there are a lot of assumptions that are created not corresponding to the truth in order to create a self-serving alternative picture of an historical background to support political views or personal beliefs. However, I must say that this mistake of stating that Thor's hammer is associated with the swastika this time doesn't seem to have been created to support any political views, but instead a honest assumption from the part of scholars and then a mistake. And this has been believed for quite some time until new evidences surfaced. This is perfectly normal. Sometimes a certain historical representation is taken as a fact until new evidences are presented and things change. But of course this creates other problems, which is trying to demonstrate to the public new evidences to let go of a past mistake, but the past mistake has been widespread for so long that the great majority of the public simply won't accept the new evidences because it's hard to let go of what we thought to be the truth for so long. So, this is what I'm going to talk about today. Mind you that I'm not going to delve too much on the swastika itself and its history. In fact, I will reserve that for a specific video in the future on the use of the swastika in Northern Europe in historical terms, but that stays for another time. However, I will briefly express a few facts concerning the swastika to better understand why it isn't Thor's hammer or why it doesn't have any association with the god Thor in pagan times and in the Viking Age, pre-Christian times, right? Also, I'll be using the term swastika for a better understanding because there isn't a known surviving name for this symbol in Old Norse aside from the term fylfot, which isn't an Old Norse term as some authors have stated, but we shall also see this throughout this video. This will be a rather short video because it's getting hard to continue on with YouTube while I'm trying to hold 3 different jobs, but I hope to deliver as much information as possible in order to properly express the main idea. So thank you very much for your patience. Now, with no more delay, let's start our today's video, my dear friends. Please. For many years, perhaps even for over a century surely, it has been a common misconception, the belief that the swastika and or the fylfot is the symbol of the god Thor and his hammer. An idea still very consolidated in academia as well, actually, but that's simply due to the fact of consulting outdated sources. Since the 19th century, with the artistic popularization of this Norse god, the studies and analysis around the figure of Thor and Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, have intensified in the same way as the studies of the most researched Eurasian symbol during the 19th century, the swastika. In the Nordic Old Norse context, there is no medieval literary source about this symbol, leading researchers to look for materials from another era, such as the Icelandic grimoires of the European Renaissance period, where the swastika is called Thor's hammer. In fact, a swastika-like symbol has been specifically named Thor's hammer, Thors Hammer, in written sources and grimoires of the second half of the 19th century. This led some scholars of the 19th century to believe that the swastika had the same connotation during the Viking Age, the Viking period. Of course, the late 19th century name Thor's hammer for a swastika-like symbol was already reporting to earlier materials, such as the example of Finnur Magnusson in the book Runamo og Runar, in the first half of the 19th century still, where he already expresses this idea of the name Thors Hammer to a symbol seemingly in a swastika shape. But it's in the book Icelandic Folk Tales and Fairy Tales of Jon Harnason in 1862 that we are presented with an Icelandic magic staff, a gadrastafur, named Thors Hammer. And it very much looks like a swastika, and I have no doubt that the symbol itself is a reshaping of the swastika. Jon Harnason speaks of several magical staves still in use during this time, and he speaks of this Thors Hammer magic stave as a very powerful symbol. This is in the very period of the creation of the Huld manuscript, just 2 years prior to Jon Harnason's book. The Huld manuscript by Geir Vigfússon was composed in 1860, which is the source that expresses for the first time the famous magic stave Vigvisir, which I've talked about on a previous video. But in this same source, the author presents us with a magic stave named Thors Hammer, which is the depiction of a head, a human head, but inserted in the head there's a symbol that is quite similar to the swastika-shaped symbol, also called Thors Hammer. So, what happens here are literary sources of the 19th century of a symbol that resembles a swastika and is named Thors Hammer. So many scholars assume that this idea was also present in the Viking Age. So every swastika symbol of the Germanic Iron Age and of the Scandinavian Viking period that was found was automatically assumed to be a representation of Thor and Thor's hammer, because of the association between this symbol with Thor in the 19th century, over 800 years after the end of the Viking period and over 1,000 years after the end of the migration period. Speaking of the migration period, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries begins a great study on bracteates, and bracteates researchers allegedly identified the god Thor as being associated with the swastika, because swastikas appear in bracteates, sometimes alongside deities or human figures, which have been automatically assumed to be Thor. But in reality, they were representations of the god Odin. It all points to that, to the god Odin. In fact, there's a very good example, which is the Djúprún bracteate of the 5th, 6th century, of the Common Era, of course, where we can see the runic formula, Alu, I've spoken of on another video, but right below the figure of a person on a horse, with what also seems to be the representation of a raven, there's a swastika below. When swastikas are represented in objects with clear depictions of a figure, a human figure, it always points out to be Odin, and there are no evidences of being associated with Thor. So we are talking about bracteates as little gold and or silver medallions from the Migration and Merovingian period, Germanic Iron Age, prior to the Viking Age in Scandinavia, and some of these artifacts depict the representation of swastikas. And because the swastika was associated with Thor in the 19th century, researchers automatically assumed that swastikas in bracteates alluded to Thor as well, when there's no actual evidence of it whatsoever. Also, many 19th century artists had access to these researches, and the second half of the 19th century marks a particular emphasis on a swastika-like magic stave we have seen previously from Iceland, associated with Thor. And so many artists at this time start producing works mixing the deity Thor with the symbol, the swastika, like the famous painting Thors Strid Mjærtana by Morten Eskil Winge in 1872. This is possibly one of the most famous depictions of Thor, and you can see the swastika represented in Thor's belt, right? There were also several illustrations by Lawrence Frölich, 1895, also a famous illustration right here, somewhere on the screen, and there's the swastika associated with Thor, as you can see. Another example, the sculpture by Carl Johan Bonnesen from the Carlsberg Brewery in 1901, which can still be seen on top of this building in Copenhagen. The depiction of Thor riding a chariot and the swastika on the wheel of the chariot. So I think you get the point that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, several artists also started to express this connection between Thor and the swastika. And at this point, it simply becomes common knowledge. It became common knowledge, right? In fact, in the 20th century, several scholars continue with this association, following the example of Hilda Davidson. Hilda Davidson is one of the many sources I use, and it's still great today. I did a book review of one of her books, which I still consider to be a very, very good source. But some conceptions she demonstrated are now wrong because research continues, of course, obviously. She also stated this connection between Thor and the swastika. And how not? I mean, it was becoming, or by her time, it was already common knowledge, so it was an honest mistake. However, there's been several recent iconographic surveys and analysis of several Nordic symbols present in the end of antiquity until the Central Middle Ages: bracteates, runes, tapestries, Anglo-Danish monuments, churches, crosses, which I shall develop on another video concerning the swastika, but it has been concluded that there is no evidence whatsoever of this association, Thor and or Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, being associated with the swastika or the Fyrfot. All visual manifestations of the swastika in the Nordic context until the time of Scandinavian Christianization were linked solely to the god Odin. Then, after Christianization and during the Middle Ages, a lot more swastikas appear in Scandinavian context in churches, as Christians borrowed the symbol and incorporated it into Christian context. There are pre-Christian Scandinavian representations of swastikas, of course. We have seen here the case of the bracteates, for instance. But the great majority of swastikas in Northern Europe actually appear after Christianization in Scandinavian context within churches. Almost all, if not all, the swastikas present in runestones are from runestones after Christianization, raised during Christianization and in Christian context. And this is very important to mention, and it makes all the difference. The swastika in pre-Christian context in Scandinavia was usually in contexts alongside solar symbols, often appearing with symbols associated with the sun and sun wheels, as well as stylized representation of spirals, and appearing in identical contexts or associated with Odin and death, as well as symbols of protection. However, the use of magical pagan symbols did not stop with Christianization. They were simply absorbed by the new religion and placed on different Christian contexts. I have expressed that here on this channel in relation to the famous labyrinth Trojabo, and the widespread of depictions of this symbol in Scandinavian context by Christians. The great majority of swastikas in Scandinavia appear after Christianization, as I've said, as a symbol of protection, not just in runestones after Christianization and depicted in a Christian religious background or context, such as inserting the swastika in Christian crosses in plain sight, but literally the use of swastikas in churches, within churches, in the very decoration of the interior of churches of Scandinavian Middle Ages and periods that came after Christianization in the north. And this is important to address because the swastika continue to be used, a lot more used actually in Christian context and for a longer period than it was ever used in pagan context of Germanic Iron Age. And so it becomes a Christian symbol of protection that will continue to be used in Christian context associated with Christ and as a cross symbol of protection. And so it continues to appear until at least the 19th century, having a couple of transformations along the way. But this isn't the only thing important to reflect on. You see, Catholicism did not completely prohibit pagan festivities and customs. It actually incorporated them in the Christian liturgical calendar to facilitate conversion by maintaining important pagan celebrations and behaviors, but now expressed within Christian celebratory context. So, many old pagan gods not only remained present in folklore, but also in traditional folk magic. In the case of Sweden, old pagan gods are found in trolldom, and in svartaknost black art books, right, which are the sort of family grimoires containing all sorts of spells, magic, incantations, cures for several illnesses. But the Old Norse gods are evoked in these spells, incantations, and even prayers, no longer understood as pagan gods, in fact completely stripped of their original meanings, but now evoked alongside Judeo-Christian and biblical figures and demons. The same thing that happened precisely during the European Renaissance period in Iceland, and old pagan gods evoked alongside biblical figures, demons and fallen angels. The great importance of Thor during the end of the Viking period made this deity continue to be present within Nordic folklore and traditional folk magic and spell books, to be evoked now not as a pagan god anymore, but as a figure of power alongside the Christian God, Jesus, Mary, the apostles, and such, evoked in spells and incantations. And Thor continued to be present in these spells and incantations. Troll formula or spell as a spoken spell or incantation, usually either in free verse or rhyming, and such spells in relation to fertility and in rural agrarian contexts. After Christianization, mostly between the 17th and the 19th centuries, Thor continues to be present in magic formulas in Scandinavian folk magic. Thor occasionally occurs in formulas of power and mentioned in a few spells, the same way he appears in magic formulas and magic staves, Gadrastafir, in Iceland. So his hammer sort of continues to be associated with fertility, but no longer the actual iconographic representation of Thor's hammer in the Viking period. But the idea of a Thor's hammer as a term only, and a religious association with fertility, which became associated with the swastika because the swastika became a protective Christian symbol, after Christianization, obviously. The actual Viking Age depiction of Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, was never associated with the swastika, ever. What actually happened here is that after Christianization, the swastika became a Christian symbol of protection, and Thor's hammer as a term, as a name, associated with fertility and power and not a symbol, was fused with the symbology of the swastika. So then appears the fattigklubba, a club or a hammer of the poor, also called a club of beggars, as a symbol made of wood to show that the person who brought the club or the hammer was poor and needed a living. To a very poor person was assigned a fattigklubba, a poor club, as a sign of their status. And so the person and a family wielding this wooden hammer would demonstrate how poor they were, to let people know. So they were expected to contribute with what they could in exchange for food, care, and housing. Instead of having to go through some humiliation and go through acts of begging or dying of starvation, etc., this was a sign that the person was willing to work in a household in exchange for food and shelter. Some of these fattigklubba had the swastika carved on them as a Christian protective symbol. As the example I hopefully demonstrate here somewhere on the screen. Fattigklubba, a wooden hammer used in rural confraternities in Sweden, 18th century. So there's a fusion here of specific religious and traditional folk magical elements, the swastika as a Christian protective symbol, Thor as an entity evoked in some magic formulas related to power, and a hammer as a sign of the poor who look for a livelihood in rural areas within a household. This mixture of elements, quite present in the 18th century in Scandinavia, eventually reached Iceland in the 19th century, and a swastika-like symbol as a protective symbol starts to be associated with Thor as well, because Thor alone, without any symbol associated to him now, was already being evoked in spells and in incantations. So, in the 19th century in Iceland, finally there's a swastika-like symbol that is associated with Thor, and it is called Thor's Hammer, not as a Viking Age depiction of Thor's hammer, but an allusion to the swastika as a Christian protective symbol depicted on actual hammers of the poor fattigdoba. And so, in the 19th century in Iceland, there's a development of this symbol, appearing in the Huld manuscript in 1860. Then Jon Harnason presents this symbol in 1862 as a magic stave of great power present in folklore. And later on we have, of course, Jakub Magnus Egardsson in 1940, presenting his grimoire and a different expression of the same symbol. He continues to call Thor's hammer as one of the most powerful talismans there is for every type of magic. And it's actually curious, this association between the swastika and a hammer of the poor that would later become eventually associated with Thor, if we remember that Thor, as a pagan deity, was associated with fertility, an agrarian context, and with the common folk. Anyway, despite many authors' artistic representations and works that have popularized the god Thor linked to the swastika, there is no iconographic context or material to prove this. This association appears to have been created in the modern period, within a Christian context, but also associated with the traditional folk magic of the 17th until the 19th century. But during the Viking period, there is no iconographic evidence of this connection. Thor only becomes associated with the swastika in the modern period, in most contexts more than 800 years after the end of the Viking Age, while the earliest contexts point to half a millennium after the end of the Viking Age, and very much in a Christian agrarian context. Also, before I forget, it must be pointed out that there's been a lot of claims, especially throughout the 20th century, that the Nordic term for the swastika is fylefot. But this is an Anglo-Saxon term, actually. The Old Norse term is not known, although there is an Old Norse term which is solarfell, which is sun wheel or sun wheels, but doesn't specifically refer to the swastika, but to several sun wheel symbols instead, such as the spiral, triskelion, and such other motifs, but no actual Old Norse term for the symbol of the swastika. Anyway, don't worry, in the future I shall develop a video solely for the swastika in Scandinavian context, from Germanic Iron Age, migration period, into the Viking period. I'll develop this if I manage to have a little respite from my jobs and if I manage to survive the pressure. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. I hope this video was useful. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Farewell.